The new revival church was full of parishioners that Sunday morning. Sunlight streamed through the colored stained glass windows, painting rainbow spots on the wooden floor and the dark faces of those gathered. Women in brightly colored dresses and hats sat on the left, men in strict suits on the right. Children, unaccustomedly quiet, huddled around their parents. Lakita Jefferson played the old organ, her fingers gliding lightly across the keys, extracting the solemn sounds of the hymn. The melody soared through the vaults of the church, making the hearts of the congregation tremble with awe. Pastor Augustine Brooks ascended the pulpit at 11 o'clock in the morning, as he had done every Sunday for the past 15 years. His tall figure in his snow-white vestments radiated confidence and dignity. His dark face shone with an inner light. His eyes looked penetrating and stern. "Brothers and sisters," the pastor's voice filled the space of the church, strong and melodious. "Today is a special day, a day when we must praise the Lord for His mercy and blessing." He paused, looking around the congregation, and his eyes paused for a moment on his wife, sitting in the front row. Jemima Brooks, a short woman with kind eyes and a soft smile, nodded slightly to her husband. "For 10 years, the pastor continued, for 10 long years, Sister Jemima and I have prayed for a blessing, and today I can tell you that the Lord has heard our prayers." A gasp of delight went through the church. All eyes turned to Jemima, who lowered her eyes in embarrassment. "Yes, brothers and sisters," the pastor's voice trembled with excitement. "My wife is expecting a child. In 3 months, a new life will be born into our family. Isn't this a miracle? Isn't this a manifestation of God's grace?" "Amen," the congregation echoed in unison. "Hallelujah," shouted from the back rows. Jemima looked up to meet her husband's eyes. Her face glowed with happiness, but in the depths of her dark eyes lurked anxiety. She placed a hand on her visibly rounded belly, a protective gesture that did not escape the scrutiny of Chandra Taylor, who sat nearby. Chandra, whom everyone in the congregation called the mother of the church, was observant. 65 years of living in a small community had taught her to notice little things that others missed, and now she saw something the others didn't. The pastor had a smile on his lips, but his eyes remained as cold as the rocks at the bottom of a river. After the service, the congregation surrounded Jemima, congratulating her on her God's blessing. Women touched her belly. Men respectfully shook hands with the pastor. The air rang with cheers and good wishes. "It's a miracle, Sister Jemima," chirped young Tiffany Robinson, newly married. "I've always believed that the Lord would answer your prayers." "What a blessing to our congregation," said Marcus Williams, one of the elders of the church. "This child will be special, marked by God's grace." Jemima smiled gratefully as she accepted the congratulations, but her eyes kept returning to her husband. Augustine stood surrounded by men, accepting the congratulations with a look of modest dignity. He smiled, nodded, and shook the outstretched hands. But when he thought no one was looking, his face stiffened, and there was an expression in his eyes that made Jemima feel cold. Only Chandra noticed the change. The old woman watched the pastor from a distance, and her heart clenched with a vague premonition. Something was wrong in this perfect picture of family happiness. The Brooks house stood not far from the church, a modest 2-story building with a neat garden and white picket fence. When they returned from the service, Augustine went straight to his study, citing the need to prepare the evening sermon. Jemima was left alone in the kitchen. She slowly removed her holiday dress, changed into her home dress, and began to prepare dinner. Her hands moved mechanically, chopping vegetables, stirring sauce, measuring spices. Her thoughts were far away. After an hour, she called her husband to the table, but Augustine refused to come down. His voice sounded muffled through the closed office door. "I'm not hungry. I have a lot of work to do." Jemima ate alone, then cleared the table, washed the dishes. There was an unnatural silence in the house, broken only by the ticking of the old clock in the living room and Augustine's infrequent footsteps overhead. In the evening, he left without saying where he was going. He simply put on his coat and walked out, tossing it over his shoulder. "I'll be back late. Don't wait up." Left alone, Jemima sat in the living room for a long time, staring at the darkening sky outside the window. Then she picked up her cell phone and dialed Lakita's number. "He knows," she said without preamble when her friend answered. "I'm sure he knows." Lakita's voice sounded concerned. "What makes you think that? Did he say something?" "No, but—" Jemima hesitated. "Did you see his eyes today? He looked at me like he was, like he wanted to kill me." "You're exaggerating," Lakita tried to reassure her. "It's just nerves, pregnancy, hormones." "No," Jemima said firmly. "It's not hormones. He's barely spoken to me since I told him about the baby. He locks himself in his office. He's gone all day. And when he looks at me—" Her voice trembles. "I'm scared, Lakita. I'm really scared." There was silence. Then Lakita asked quietly, "Are you sure he can't, be a father?" "Absolutely." Jemima spoke so softly that her friend had to strain to hear. "When he was 19, he suffered a serious illness. The doctor said he would never be able to have children. He told me about it before we got married, said he understood if I changed my mind. But I loved him and said I didn't care." "And now you're pregnant." Lakita stretched out thoughtfully. "Yes, and he knows it's not his. Does the father know?" Jemima was silent for a moment, then answered quietly, "Yes. He sent a message this morning. He asked how I was feeling." "You have to leave," Lakita said firmly. "Come to my place, right now." "I can't," Jemima's voice shook. "Where would I go? What will I tell people? The whole congregation is talking about God's blessing." "To hell with the congregation!" For the first time, Lakita's voice became harsh. "Your life is more important." "I'll think about it," Jemima replied uncertainly. "Maybe I'm exaggerating. Maybe it'll all work out." The front door slammed, announcing her husband's return. Hastily saying goodbye to her friend, Jemima hung up the phone and stood still, listening to the heavy footsteps in the hallway. Augustine walked past the living room without a glance at his wife and went back upstairs to the study. The door slammed shut, turning the key in the lock. Jemima exhaled slowly. She didn't know what was worse, the open confrontation or this oppressive silence. The next morning, as she was preparing breakfast, there was a knock at the door. Dexter Whitehead, the head of the church council, stood on the doorstep, a tall, stately man with close-cropped gray hair and a commanding gaze. "Sister Jemima," he nodded respectfully. "Is the pastor at home?" "Yes, in the study," she replied, stepping back to let the guest pass. Dexter went upstairs, and soon there were animated voices coming from the study. Jemima couldn't make out the words, but the tone was excited. Then came Dexter's loud laughter and Augustine's exclamation. When the men came down to breakfast, the parson's face was glowing with joy for the first time in many days. "Jemima," he put his arm around his wife's shoulders almost tenderly, "I have great news. Dexter, tell her." The head of the church board cleared his throat. "The Church of the Holy Redemption in the Northern District is looking for a senior pastor. Their previous minister is retiring, and they have offered the position to our Augustine." "That's wonderful," Jemima said, feeling her shoulders tense under her husband's hands. "Twice the flock," Dexter continued excitedly. "More influence, more opportunities for ministry, and of course more—" he hesitated, "material blessings." "When?" Jemima asked. "In a month," Augustine answered, and there was a twinkle of relief in his eyes. "We'll be moving into the rectory at the church. It's much bigger than ours. 5 bedrooms, a big garden, the perfect place for a family." He said the last word with a barely perceptible hesitation that only Jemima caught. After Dexter left, Augustine disappeared back into the study. Jemima could hear him pacing the room, moving things around, opening desk drawers. Then there was silence. In the evening, as she was getting ready for bed, Augustine came down into the parlor. His face was pale, his eyes glittered feverishly. "What are you looking for?" Jemima asked, watching him go through the papers in the dresser drawer. "Old papers," he answered absent-mindedly. "I need a medical certificate for my new position. I want to find the results of last year's examination." Jemima felt her breath catching. "In the top drawer of your desk. I put all the medical records there." Augustine nodded and went back upstairs. A few minutes later, Jemima heard the sound of shattering glass and a muffled curse. She froze, listening, but nothing more followed. At night, She couldn't sleep for a long time. Thoughts swirled in her head, giving her no rest. Maybe Lakita was right. Maybe she should leave before it was too late. She turned on her side, looking at the empty half of the bed. Augustine still hadn't come down from the study. Pale moonlight poured in through the window, painting fanciful patterns on the wall. At some point, fatigue took its toll, and Jemima fell into a restless sleep. She dreamed of a church full of empty-eyed people and of Augustine in the pulpit, speaking strange, frightening words about sacrifice and redemption. She did not hear the bedroom door open. Nor did she see Augustine enter slowly, holding in his hand a heavy marble paperweight, a gift from the congregation for his decade of ministry. His face in the moonlight seemed carved from stone, his eyes dry and empty. In his other hand he clutched 2 pieces of paper. The first was a 15-year-old medical certificate, yellowed by time, which read in black and white, Diagnosis, azoospermia, prognosis, irreversible infertility. The second was a printout of messages from his wife's cell phone, which he checked while she was cooking dinner. The last message from a caller, recorded as D, read, How are you feeling? I'm thinking about you and our baby every minute. Augustine stood over his sleeping wife, clutching a heavy paperweight in his hand. Moonlight played on the marble surface, picking out the engraved words, For faithful service to the Lord. The morning sun was already high when Laquita Jefferson knocked firmly on the door of the Brooks house. Yesterday's conversation with Jemima had kept her up all night. She'd tried calling her friend several times, but the phone was stubbornly unanswered. Jemima? Laquita called out, knocking on the door again. Are you home? It was silent. Only the curtain in the living room window shook slightly in the draft. Walking around the house, Laquita peered through the kitchen window. There was a cup of unfinished tea on the table, and an open Bible lying next to it. It looked as if the landlady had gone out for a moment and was about to return. Overcoming her growing anxiety, Laquita walked back to the front door and gently pushed on the knob. To her surprise, the door was unlocked. Jemima? She called out again, entering the hallway. It's me, Laquita. The house greeted her with an oppressive silence. Laquita walked slowly into the living room, then into the kitchen. No one was there. An inner voice insisted on going upstairs. She climbed the stairs, trying to tread as quietly as possible, though she herself didn't understand why she was sneaking around in an empty house. The bedroom door was ajar. Laquita peeked inside and froze, unable to believe her eyes. Jemima was lying on the bed, unnaturally stretched out. Her eyes were open, but no longer seeing anything in the world. Dried blood caked on her temple and stained the white pillowcase. A scream caught in Laquita's throat. She slowly settled to the floor, unable to take her eyes off her friend's dead face. Then everything happened in a blur. The call to the police. Sirens. Uniformed men filling the quiet house. Questions she could barely find the strength to answer. Did you find the body? What time? Was the door open? Did you touch anything? Pastor Augustine showed up just as the police were finishing their sweep of the scene. He jumped out of the cab with a horrified look on his face and rushed toward the house, but was stopped on the doorstep. What happened? Where's my wife? His voice was breaking. When the detective informed him of Jemima's death, Augustine collapsed to his knees right on the front lawn. His shoulders shook with sobs, his hands clinging helplessly to the grass. No, not again, he repeated. God, why? Laquita watched him from the porch, feeling a cold emptiness growing inside. Something about his grief seemed wrong, too theatrical, too loud. Pastor Brooks, Detective Moore, a full black man with attentive eyes, helped Augustine up. I need to ask you a few questions. Yeah, I don't understand what happened. Augustine wiped his eyes. I was in church all night, preparing for the morning service. Then I met with some colleagues from the Northern District. I just came from there. You spent the night in the church? The detective asked. Can anyone confirm that? No, I was alone. But Dexter showed up around 8 o'clock in the morning. We drove to the north side together. You can ask him. By late afternoon, word of the tragedy had spread throughout the community. The Brooks house was surrounded by parishioners bringing flowers and candles. Women wept. Men stood silently with their hats off. Dexter Whitehead organized an impromptu prayer service right on the lawn. Brothers and sisters, his deep voice overlapped the murmur of voices. Today our congregation suffered a grievous loss. Sister Jemima was a light to us all, and now that light has been extinguished. Detective Moore stood to the side, observing the gathered crowd. His gaze traveled from one face to another, noting details that others might not have noticed. Augustine sat in a pew, surrounded by the support of the congregation. His face was swollen with tears, his shoulders slumped. But in his eyes, as he lifted them, the detective saw something else besides grief. Something akin to relief? "Detective?" A quiet voice made Moore turn around. Standing next to him was an older woman with shrewd eyes. "I'm Chandra Taylor. I need to talk to you." They walked back to the police car, away from the crowd. "Something's not right here," Chandra began without preamble. "Yesterday at the service, the pastor announced Jemima's pregnancy. Everyone rejoiced, but..." "But?" The detective nudged her. "His eyes..." Chandra shook her head. "I've known the pastor for 15 years. I've never seen that look, cold as a snake's. It wasn't the look of a happy father-to-be." The detective made a note in his notebook. "Anything else?" "Rumors." The old woman pressed her lips together. "A long time ago. Said the pastor couldn't have children. Some disease in his youth. But that was before he came to our congregation. No one ever talked about it out loud." Back at the station, Detective Moore started going through the preliminary reports. Time of death was between midnight and 3 a.m. Cause was blunt force trauma to the head. No murder weapon found. No signs of a struggle. Victim was most likely asleep when she was struck. The pastor claimed he spent the night at the church preparing for the service. Then, early in the morning, he met with Dexter Whitehead, and they drove to the north neighborhood together to discuss his new position. Augustine's burglar theory looked doubtful. Nothing was missing from the house. No sign of forced entry. The door was unlocked, as if the killer had quietly walked out, knowing he would meet no one on the way. "Johnson," Moore turned to the young deputy. "Check to see if Pastor Brooks had any criminal records or priors." The next day, the detective received the first results of the investigation and medical examination. Jemima Brooks was indeed pregnant 6 months. The baby, a boy, died with his mother. In her phone, they found a correspondence with the subscriber D. In the last message, he asked how she was feeling and mentioned their baby. The number turned out to be registered to a Dexter Whitehead. An interesting discovery was the medical records found in the pastor's office. A 15-year-old certificate confirmed the diagnosis of irreversible infertility after a youthful illness. "So much for motive," Moore muttered, looking through the papers. "Wife cheats with his closest friend. Gets pregnant even though he can't have children himself. Announces it to the whole community as a blessing from God. Anybody would have flipped out." But the evidence was still lacking. No one saw the pastor at home the night of the murder. Dexter confirmed that he met him at the church that morning. It looked like Augustine had actually spent the night there, just like he claimed. The detective decided to talk to Lakita Jefferson again. She was the last person to talk to Jemima before she died, and the first person to find the body. They met at a small cafe near the church. Lakita looked gaunt, dark circles under her eyes. "She was afraid of him," Lakita said quietly, fiddling with a cup of cold coffee. "The last time we talked, she said Augustine looked at her like he wanted to kill her." "Why?" the detective asked. What had happened between them? Lakita was silent for a long time, as if struggling with herself. Then she exhaled. Jemima was going to leave him, to the baby's father. She knew Augustine couldn't be the father. He'd told her so himself before the wedding. And who is the father? Lakita was silent again, her eyes downcast. "Dexter," she finally said. "Dexter Whitehead. It had happened a few times. Jemima didn't want to, but then she fell in love. They planned to be together." "But Dexter claims he was with the pastor the morning of the murder," the detective said thoughtfully. "He's giving him an alibi." "Dexter doesn't know." Lakita shook her head. "He doesn't know that Augustine knows about their relationship. Jemima didn't have time to tell him. Or he knows, but he's covering up for the killer," Moore muttered. "I wonder why." Lakita stood up, about to leave, but the detective stopped her. "One more question. You said Jemima was afraid of her husband. Why? Did he threaten her? Did he hit her?" "No, never." Lakita shook her head. But one day she found some old newspaper clippings from Chicago before Augustine was a pastor. It was about a girl who'd been assaulted. She'd been brutally beaten. Augustine was the suspect, but the case was closed because the girl refused to testify. The church intervened, took him into care. That's how he became a pastor, as a form of redemption. The detective made a note in his notebook. "Thank you for the information, Ms. Jefferson. Stay in touch." Back at the station, Moore found a folder on his desk with the results of Pastor Brooks' background check. Just as Lakita had said, 20 years ago in Chicago, there was a case of assault on a girl, Augustine Brooks. Then a 19-year-old student was the prime suspect. The victim withdrew her statement at the last minute. The case was dropped. 3 days after Jemima's death, a memorial service was held at New Revival Church. The entire building was filled to capacity. It seemed like the whole town had come to say goodbye to the pastor's wife. The casket, closed because of the nature of the injuries, was covered with flowers. Pastor Augustine stood by, tall and straight, his face expressing mournful dignity. Only his eyes, deeply sunken and feverishly glittering, betrayed his inner state. Detective Moore sat in the last row, watching the scene. Dexter Whitehead stood beside the coffin, pale and gaunt. His gaze was fixed on the pastor, a mixture of guilt, fear, and something else the detective couldn't decipher. When it was time for the sermon, Augustine stepped up to the pulpit. His voice, usually strong and confident, now sounded strained. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "today we say goodbye to my wife, Jemima. The Lord has called her to himself too soon. We cannot know his designs. We cannot understand why he took this light from us, but we must trust that all things are his will." The pastor paused, looking around the congregation. When he spoke again, his voice became harsher. "The scripture says, 'I will have vengeance, and I will repay.' God sees everything, every betrayal, every sin. Nothing escapes his eyes." Dexter flinched as if struck by a blow. His gaze flickered to the pastor's face, but he was looking over the heads of the congregation. "Jemima was a good woman," Augustine went on, "but we are all sinners. We are all tempted, and we are all responsible for our actions, to men and to God." A quiet whisper spread through the congregation. Such a sermon seemed odd for a memorial service. "I forgive you, Jemima." The pastor's voice trembled. "I forgive all your sins, just as I forgive those who have sinned with you. For it is written, 'Forgive, and you shall be forgiven.'" Detective Moore frowned. There was clearly a double meaning in the pastor's words. Forgiveness sounded almost like an accusation. After the service, the congregation slowly dispersed, talking softly. Many approached the pastor to express their condolences. He accepted them meekly, thanking them for their support, but his eyes remained dry and cold. Dexter kept to himself, avoiding direct contact with Augustine. As the detective passed by, their gazes met for a moment, and Moore saw in the eyes of the head of the church council the hunted fear of a hunted animal. Detective Moore sat at his desk with the crime scene photos spread out in front of him. 2 weeks of investigation had finally begun to yield results. Forensics had found skin particles and microscopic traces of blood on a marble paperweight found in the bushes behind Brooks' house. The fingerprints on it belonged to the pastor, which wasn't surprising. The item belonged to him, but the traces of the victim's blood on it changed the case. "We found something else." Sergeant Wilson, a young, ambitious forensic scientist, put the report folder on the table. There were signs of a struggle after all. There were bruises on the victim's wrists, like from being grabbed. Neck had micro damage typical of strangulation. She'd fought back before being struck. Moore nodded slowly. The picture of the crime was becoming clearer. "That's not enough for an arrest warrant," he observed. "We need something else. Something that puts the pastor at the crime scene at the time of the murder." "There is something." Wilson opened the folder. "A camera at a gas station 2 blocks from Brooks's house caught a car that looks like the pastor's at 2 a.m. The image isn't very clear, but we see a dark sedan of the same make. And a neighbor across the street saw someone leaving the house around 3 a.m. He didn't see a face, but he described a tall man in dark clothes. So the pastor's lying, Moore concluded. He wasn't at the church all night. He was on his way home. One more thing, Wilson added. We checked the calls from the victim's cell phone. The last call was to Lakita Jefferson just before midnight, but there was another incoming call at 1:30 from Dexter Whitehead, a short one, less than a minute. Interesting, the detective muttered. The kid's father calling in the middle of the night. Maybe that's what triggered the conflict. A plan of action formed quickly. Get a warrant for the pastor's arrest. Interrogate Dexter about the late-night call, and talk to Lakita again. Something told Moore she knew more than she was letting on. But fate had it differently. The warrant was obtained by evening, but when the police arrived at the Brooks' house, there was no one there. A neighbor said she'd seen the pastor leaving with a large bag in the afternoon. Shit, Moore cursed. Somebody tipped him off. Put out a BOLO, check the airport, the bus station, every exit out of town. Next step was a visit to Dexter Whitehead. The head of the church council met the detective in his spacious office at the church. He looked calm, but tension lurked in the corners of his eyes. I've heard that before. Dexter folded his hands on the table. You think Pastor Brooks killed his wife? That's absurd. Where is he? Moore asked bluntly. I have no idea, Dexter shrugged. Maybe he went away for a couple days to be alone. His wife's death had taken a toll on him. So much so that he ran when he heard about the arrest warrant? Moore stepped forward. Why did you call Jemima the night of the murder? Dexter froze, his face frozen for a moment. I didn't call her. It's in the phone records, 1:30 a.m. from your number. Yeah, Dexter hesitated. It was a mistake. I wanted to call my sister, but I accidentally dialed Jemima's number. When I realized the mistake, I immediately reset it. And you didn't call your sister back? It was late. I figured I'd call in the morning. The detective made a note in his notebook. The lie was obvious, but finding the fugitive was more important. If the pastor contacts you, let us know immediately. Moore placed his business card on the table. He's dangerous, and he's on the run. That makes him even more dangerous. After leaving the church, the detective went straight to Lakita Jefferson's house. The organist didn't open the door right away, and Moore realized from her tearful eyes that she'd already heard the news. Do you know where he is? He asked without preamble. No, Lakita shook her head. I don't want to know. He killed my best friend. I want the whole truth, Ms. Jefferson. The detective walked into the modest living room. Everything you know about Jemima's relationship with her husband and with Dexter Whitehead. Lakita was silent for a long moment, then took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was quiet but firm. I didn't tell you everything back then. Jemima was afraid for a reason. A few weeks before she died, she had started bleeding. She was scared for the baby and went to the hospital. They found bruises on her abdomen. The doctor asked if she had been abused. She denied everything, but later she confessed to me. Lakita's voice trembled. Augustin beat her. Several times. After she announced she was pregnant. He didn't say anything, just came into the bedroom at night and hit her, on her stomach, like he wanted to kill the baby. Why didn't she go to the police? Moore asked, feeling the anger rising inside. She was afraid. Lakita wiped away a tear. For herself, for the baby, and for his father. Dexter? Lakita looked at the detective strangely. She never told me the father's name, not even to me. I thought it was Dexter, they were close. But now I'm not so sure. Why not? Because Dexter keeps defending the pastor. Would he do that if he knew he killed the mother of his child? By late afternoon, news of the pastor's escape and the warrant for his arrest had spread throughout the community. Opinions were divided. Some thought it was a mistake, that the pastor was incapable of murder. Others recalled Augustine's strange behavior in recent days and the somber sermon at the funeral. An emergency meeting was held in the church. Dexter gave a fiery speech in defense of the pastor, urging the congregation not to believe slander and calumny. Chandra Taylor, on the other hand, openly stated that she had long suspected something was amiss and urged everyone to help the police find the killer. How can you say that? Dexter was outraged. Pastor Brooks is a man of God. He's led us in the path of righteousness for 20 years. And before that, he almost beat a girl to death in Chicago, Chandra countered. It was only the church's intervention that kept him out of jail. Maybe not for nothing. The congregation buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Opinions were almost equally divided, and only Lakita sat silently in the corner, fiddling with her rosary and silently moving her lips in prayer. Detective Moore had received a report from the traffic police. A car that looked like the pastor's had been seen on the way out of town. It was heading south toward Portland. An interception plan was announced, but so far to no avail. Near midnight, a knock sounded on the door of Dexter Whitehead's house. The head of the church council opened the door and stood before him. Augustin Brooks, gaunt, with sunken eyes and stubble on his cheeks. "I need your help," the pastor said hoarsely. "Documents, money, a car." Dexter silently let him in and closed the door. In the living room, he poured the pastor a whiskey, a gesture unthinkable a week ago in the home of a man of deep faith. "The police are looking for you," Dexter said, sitting down across from him. "They found the murder weapon, with your fingerprints and Jemima's blood on it." "I didn't kill her." Augustine took a swig of whiskey. "This is a setup. Someone wants me dead." "And who would that be?" Dexter asked quietly. "How should I know?" The pastor drummed his fingers nervously on the table. "Could it be you?" "Me?" Dexter shuddered. "Why me?" "Because the baby was yours." Augustine stepped forward, his eyes glittering feverishly. "You think I didn't know? I saw your messages. I think of you and our baby every minute." Touching. Dexter turned pale. "Augustus, Don't make excuses." The pastor held up his hand. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that I didn't kill her. And you have to help me get away. You owe me." "You owe me?" Dexter asked quietly. "Yes, for sleeping with my wife. For getting her pregnant, knowing I couldn't have kids, for making me look like an asshole in front of the whole community." Dexter stared at the pastor for a long moment, then slowly stood up. "I'll help you. But first I need to get something upstairs." He returned a few minutes later with an envelope in his hands. "There's $5,000 in here, all I have in cash, and the spare keys to my car. It's in the garage, clean, no beacons. No one will be looking for it." Augustin grabbed the envelope with shaky hands. "Thank you. I knew I could count on you." "Where are you going?" "It's better you don't know. It's safer for both of us." Dexter nodded. "Only, before you go, there's something I need to show you." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it out to the pastor. He unfolded it and froze. It was a printout of the DNA test results. "What is it?" Augustin asked hoarsely. "The results of the paternity test," Dexter answered quietly. "I'm not the father of Jemima's baby." The pastor reread the document several times as if he couldn't believe his eyes. "Then who is?" "I don't know." Dexter shook his head. "But it wasn't me. And if you killed her thinking you were getting revenge on both of us, you were wrong." Augustine dropped the sheet to the floor, his face contorted with a grimace of pain and rage. No, it can't be true." "I'm sorry." Dexter took a step back. "I called the police while I was upstairs. They're on their way." Madness flashed in the pastor's eyes. He lunged for the door, but Dexter tried to stop him. In the ensuing struggle, Augustine was stronger. He pushed his former friend away, grabbed the car keys, and ran out of the house. By the time police arrived, Dexter's car was gone from the garage. "He's heading toward the church," Dexter told Detective Moore. He was out of it, completely insane. And he was right. Pastor Augustine Brooks did indeed drive to the new revival church. His deranged mind was seeking one last solace in the place that had been his refuge and fortress for so many years. He did not expect to find people there. It was deep night. But a prayer vigil was in progress in the church. About 20 parishioners, mostly women, were praying for Jemima's soul and for the truth that should shed light on her death. When the doors swung open and the pastor appeared on the threshold, disheveled, wild-eyed, the worshippers froze. Some shrieked, some stepped toward the exit. But Augustine was quicker. He slammed the doors shut and pulled a gun from his pocket. "Nobody's getting out of here," he said hoarsely. "No one." Chandra Taylor, who had been keeping vigil, rose slowly from the pew. "Pastor Brooks, Put the gun down. You're in the house of God." "House of God?" Augustine grinned bitterly. "Yeah, I used to believe that too. I thought God would protect me, guide me, save me. But where was he when my wife betrayed me? Where was he when she carried another man's child and lied to my face?" The congregation looked at each other in horror. Many wept. Some prayed silently. "I loved her," the pastor's voice trembled. "With all my heart. I accepted her barrenness as God's will, and she made me a laughingstock. God's blessing," he laughed hysterically. "A miracle, a barren couple expecting a child. Only I knew the truth, knew there was no miracle. There was betrayal." "So you killed her?" Not a question, but a statement. Chandra looked at the pastor with a mixture of pity and judgment. "I didn't mean to." Augustine shook his head. "I just wanted to talk, to find out the truth. But she confessed. She said she loved someone else, that she'd leave me. She'd take the baby, my baby." His voice broke into a scream. "How could she? After everything I'd done for her?" "The baby wasn't yours," Chandra said softly. "You know that." "He would have been mine!" The pastor pounded his fist on the pulpit. "I would have raised him as my own. I would have loved him. But she wouldn't give me a chance. She ruined everything." Police cars surrounded the church, blinkers coloring the night darkness red and blue. Detective Moore, with a megaphone, urged the pastor to surrender, guaranteeing the safety of the hostages. "They don't understand," Augustine whispered, looking out the window at the police cordon. "No one understands." "I understand." Chandra took a step toward him. "You felt betrayed, deceived, humiliated. It's a terrible feeling." "You know nothing," the pastor snapped back, but his voice sounded unsure. "I know." The old woman approached slowly, keeping her eyes on the gun in his hand. "My husband left me 40 years ago, for a young girl who was expecting a child with him. I wanted to kill them both, too. I know the feeling, Pastor. I know how it eats away at the soul." Augustine looked at her wide-eyed, as if seeing her for the first time. "What did you do?" "I forgave," Chandra answered simply. "Not right away, not easily, but I did, and it saved my soul." "It's too late for me," the pastor shook his head. "I killed her, my wife, the mother of my—" He paused. "Another man's child." "Who's the father?" Chandra asked, taking another step. "Dexter?" "No," Augustine grinned bitterly. "I thought he was too, but it's not him. Then who is it?" The pastor raised his gun, but instead of pointing it at Chandra, he put it to his own temple. "What does it matter? She took the secret with her." "No!" shouted one of the congregation. "Pastor, don't!" "Forgive me, Lord," Augustine whispered, closing his eyes. "Forgive me for my sins." His finger trembled on the trigger, but before the shot rang out, he suddenly opened his eyes and said a name that made everyone in the church freeze: Leroy Williams. The name of the congregation's doctor sounded like a thunderclap, and then a gunshot rang out, and Pastor Augustine Brooks's body collapsed to the floor in front of the altar. 3 months later, New Revival Church was slowly coming back to life. The scars of the tragedy had not yet healed, but the congregation was growing stronger from the shock. Dexter Whitehead temporarily took over as pastor, though many still looked askew at him, remembering his connection to Jemima. Lakita Jefferson stood at her friend's grave, carefully adjusting a bouquet of fresh flowers. By her side was Leroy Williams, gaunt, graying over the months. The congregation's doctor had confessed everything after the pastor's death. About his affair with Jemima, about the child they were expecting together, about his plans to leave. "I still don't understand how he found out," Leroy said quietly. "We were so careful." "The phone?" Lakita replied. "The police found a tracking program on Jemima's phone. The pastor had seen all her messages, heard all her conversations. He knew everything." They were silent, looking at the simple headstone. "Dexter protected him because he felt guilty," Lakita continued. "He thought the child was his, so he gave the pastor an alibi. It wasn't until he took a DNA test and found out the truth that he changed his mind." "Too bad it was too late," Leroy sighed. "For Jemima, yes," Lakita nodded. "But not for the truth, not for justice." They left the cemetery as the sun was setting. In the distance, they could see the steeple of the new Renaissance church, a symbol of a faith that had survived the worst of its ordeal, a symbol of a community that was learning to move on, carrying the memory of tragedy and the hope of healing.